Millionaire finds twin beggars identical to his wife on the street and lets them live in his basement without her knowing. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue as Richard Coleman's Bentley crawled through Manhattan's notorious rush-hour traffic. At 55, he had grown accustomed to these daily delays, using them as moments of reflection on his carefully constructed life. The leather-wrapped steering wheel felt cool beneath his manicured fingers as his mind wandered to the charity gala his wife Victoria would be hosting that evening at their Upper East Side mansion, Victoria. Even after 25 years of marriage, the mere thought of her name stirred something deep within him. She was everything he had ever wanted, elegant, sophisticated, and possessing a kind of old-world grace that seemed increasingly rare in modern New York society. The daughter of one of the city's most prominent families, she had chosen him, a self-made real estate mogul, over countless suitors from her own social circle. The traffic light ahead turned red, and Richard eased the car to a stop. His eyes drifted to the newly tagged underpass, where groups of people huddled against the morning chill. He had seen this scene countless times before, but today something made him look twice. There, beneath a thin blanket, sat two young girls, no more than 16, their faces bearing an uncanny resemblance to someone he knew all too well. Richard's heart nearly stopped. The girls could have been Victoria's twins from decades ago. The same delicate features, the same proud set of their shoulders despite their circumstances. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he pulled over to the curb, ignoring the angry honks from behind. "Sir, are you all right?" one of the girls called out as he approached them, his expensive Oxford shoes clicking against the concrete. Their voices carried the same refined accent he had grown to love in Victoria, despite their apparent circumstances. I couldn't help but notice you both seem to need assistance," Richard managed, his mind racing with possibilities. "What are your names?" The girls exchanged careful glances before the one on the right spoke. "I'm Emma," she said, then gestured to her sister. "This is Sophie. We don't really have a last name, not anymore." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, though a part of him already suspected the answer. "Our mother left us at a shelter years ago," Sophie explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "We ran away. The conditions there were challenging." Richard studied their faces more closely. The resemblance to Victoria was uncanny, the same high cheekbones, the same questioning arch of their eyebrows. But it was more than physical similarity. There was something in their bearing, in the way they held themselves, that spoke of breeding and refinement despite their current situation. "Listen," he said, making a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. "I have a proposition for you. I can offer you shelter, food, and safety. But there's one condition. You must promise to keep this arrangement absolutely confidential." The girl's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "Why would you help us?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the same musical quality as Victoria's. "Because," Richard paused, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes life presents us with opportunities to right past wrongs, even if they're not our own." After a moment's hesitation, the girls agreed. Richard helped them into his car, careful to ensure no one was watching. As he drove toward his mansion, his mind was already formulating a plan. The estate's sprawling grounds included a rarely used guest house, accessible through the side garden. Victoria, perpetually occupied with her social obligations and charity work, seldom ventured to that part of the property. He placed a call to Maria, his longtime housekeeper, a woman who had served the household faithfully for over a decade. "Maria, I need your discretion on a delicate matter," he began, watching the girls through his rearview mirror. They had fallen asleep, their heads resting against each other in a pose that stirred something deep in his memory. As he drove, Richard's mind wandered to the carefully curated story of Victoria's past. She had always maintained that he was her first and only love, that her life before him had been one of quiet study and social obligations. But now, looking at these girls who could have stepped out of Victoria's youth, questions he had never thought to ask began to surface. The gala that evening would require Victoria's full attention. It would give him time to settle the girls into the guest house and begin his investigation. Because one thing was certain, These girls weren't just random strangers who happened to look like his wife. They were a key to a past that Victoria had kept hidden, and Richard was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost to his perfectly orchestrated life. The guest house transformed under Maria's efficient supervision. Within hours, fresh linens adorned the beds, the pantry was stocked, and the musty air had been replaced with the subtle scent of lavender. Richard watched as Emma and Sophie explored their new sanctuary, their eyes wide with wonder at amenities most would consider basic necessities. "Mr. Coleman," Maria pulled him aside, her usual composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "There's something you should know. These girls, they remind me of someone." Richard's pulse quickened. "Go on." "Before I worked for you and Mrs. Coleman, I was employed at the St. Catherine's Home for Girls." Maria hesitated, wringing her hands. "Mrs. Coleman used to visit there years before your marriage. She would come late in the evening, always alone, always distressed." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. Victoria had never mentioned any connection to St. Catherine's, despite her extensive involvement with other charitable institutions. "Are you certain about this, Maria?" "As certain as I am standing here, sir, but there's more." Maria glanced toward the guest house where the girls were settling in. "The timing. It would have been around 16 years ago." Richard's mind raced with calculations. 16 years ago would have been just before he met Victoria. She had been recovering from what her family described as a nervous breakdown, spending time at a private facility in Switzerland. At least that was the story he had been told. "Mr. Coleman," Sophie's voice interrupted his thoughts. She stood in the doorway of the guest house, holding a photograph she had found on one of the shelves. "Who is this woman? She looks just like—" Richard crossed the room in quick strides, taking the photo from her trembling hands. It was a picture of Victoria in her youth, wearing the golden locket she still treasured, a family heirloom she claimed had belonged to her grandmother. "That's my wife," he said carefully, studying Sophie's reaction. "Victoria Coleman." Emma joined her sister, both girls staring at the photograph with an intensity that suggested more than mere curiosity. "She's beautiful," Emma whispered, but her voice carried an undercurrent of something deeper, recognition perhaps, or a memory struggling to surface. That evening, as the sounds of the gala drifted from the main house, Richard sat in his study, surrounded by old newspapers and society pages. He had begun digging into Victoria's past, searching for any mention of her activities during that crucial period 16 years ago. The official announcements spoke of her time in Switzerland, but there were gaps, weeks and months where she seemed to vanish from the society pages entirely. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "The younger one is running a fever. Should I call a doctor?" Richard's finger hovered over the reply button when another message appeared. "She's talking in her sleep. Keeps mentioning a woman with a golden locket who used to sing to her." The golden locket. Victoria's precious heirloom that she never removed, not even for sleep. The same locket that featured prominently in the photograph that had triggered such a strong reaction from the girls. A knock at his study door made him quickly close the newspaper archives. Victoria stood in the doorway, resplendent in her evening gown, the golden locket gleaming at her throat. "The guests are asking for you, darling. Is everything all right? You seem distracted lately." Richard forced a smile, rising to join her. "Just some business matters, my dear. Nothing for you to worry about." But as he followed her back to the gala, his mind was racing. The coincidences were piling up too high to ignore. The resemblance, Maria's revelation about St. Catherine's, the locket, the timing, all of it pointed to a secret that Victoria had buried deep beneath her perfect society wife facade. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and Victoria had retired to her room, Richard made his way to the guest house. He found Maria sitting beside Sophie's bed, applying a cool compress to the girl's forehead. The sight stirred something in him, a protective instinct he hadn't expected to feel. "Sir," Maria's voice was heavy with meaning, "I think it's time we discussed what really happened at St. Catherine's all those years ago." Maria's revelation about St. Catherine's opened a floodgate of information that Richard had never expected. They sat in the guest house kitchen, their voices hushed as Sophie slept in the next room, while Maria unraveled a story that had been buried for 16 years. Mrs. Coleman didn't just visit St. Catherine's, Maria explained, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea. She came specifically to the nursery wing, always after hours, always when most of the staff had gone home. I was one of the few who knew about her visits. Richard leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you ever mention this before? Because I signed a non-disclosure agreement, Maria replied, pulling a worn envelope from her apron pocket. But now seeing these girls, I can't keep quiet anymore. There's something you need to see. She handed him a yellowed newspaper clipping. It was from a small local paper, dated 16 years ago. The headline read, "Prominent family makes anonymous donation to St. Catherine's Home for Girls." Below was a photograph of the institution's facade, and in the corner, barely visible, stood a familiar figure wearing a golden locket. The donation came right after 2 newborn girls were brought to the home, Maria continued. Twins. They were registered. Has abandoned, but I was there the night they arrived. They came with a private doctor and a nurse from Lancaster Psychiatric Center. Lancaster Psychiatric Center. The name struck a chord in Richard's memory. It was one of the facilities owned by Victoria's family, though it had been sold years ago. He had always assumed it was just another business transaction, but now... The girls were kept separate from the other children, Maria went on. Special arrangements, special care. And then she would come, Mrs. Coleman, always at night. She would stand by their cribs, sometimes for hours, just watching, sometimes singing lullabies. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. I remember the lullabies, she said softly. I thought they were just dreams, but they were real, weren't they? Richard and Maria turned to find both girls standing there. Sophie, still feverish but alert, supported by her sister. The resemblance to Victoria was even more striking in the kitchen's soft lighting. Tell us the truth, Sophie pleaded. You know who we are, don't you? Before either Richard or Maria could respond, a sharp knock at the guest house door made them all freeze. Through the window, Richard caught a glimpse of Victoria's personal assistant, Thomas, standing outside. Mr. Coleman, Thomas called out. Mrs. Coleman is asking for you. She's reviewed the security footage from the gardens and, sir, she needs to speak with you immediately. Richard's blood ran cold. In his haste to help the girls, he had forgotten about the estate's extensive security system. Victoria had access to all the cameras, though she rarely checked them. What had she seen? I'll be right there, he called out, then turned to Maria. Stay with them. Don't let anyone in except me. The walk to the main house felt like an eternity. Richard's mind raced through possibilities, excuses, explanations. But as he entered Victoria's private sitting room, he knew from her expression that everything was about to change. Victoria sat perfectly still, her iPad showing frozen footage of Richard leading 2 young girls through the garden. The golden locket gleamed at her throat, catching the light with each shallow breath she took. I thought I was seeing ghosts, she whispered, not looking at him. When I first saw the footage, I convinced myself I was imagining things. But then I looked closer. She finally raised her eyes to meet his. You found them, didn't you? You found my girls. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with 16 years of secrets and lies. Richard remained silent, watching as his wife's carefully constructed facade began to crack. How long have you known? Victoria asked, her voice trembling. How long have you suspected? I didn't know anything for certain until today, Richard replied carefully. But from the moment I saw them under that underpass, Victoria, they look exactly like you. She rose abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the garden path leading to the guest house. I never thought I'd see them again, she said, more to herself than to him. I convinced myself it was better this way, that they would have a better life without the scandal, without the shame. What scandal? Richard asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Victoria, what really happened 16 years ago? She turned to face him, and for the first time in their marriage, Richard saw raw, unfiltered pain in her eyes. Remember how my family always told you I was in Switzerland before we met? That I was recovering from exhaustion? She laughed bitterly. I was at Lancaster, our family's own psychiatric facility, hidden away while I carried my shame. My father's business partner, Harrison Wells, he was married, powerful, twice my age. The pieces began falling into place in Richard's mind. Harrison Wells, the notorious businessman who had mysteriously stepped away from public life 16 years ago. The man who had been Victoria's father's closest associate until a sudden, unexplained falling out. "The girls," Richard said softly. "They're his?" Victoria's hand went to her locket, a gesture Richard had seen countless times, but now understood differently. "They're mine," she corrected, her voice gaining strength. "They were always mine." Harrison wanted nothing to do with them. His reputation, his marriage, his position on the board of multiple companies. He couldn't risk it all for a scandal with a 20-year-old girl. She opened the locket, revealing not the family photograph Richard had always assumed was inside, but a tiny picture of two newborn girls. "My father arranged everything. The private wing at Lancaster, the transfer to St. Catherine's, the cover story about Switzerland. Even Maria's silence was bought and paid for. Everything was handled with the utmost discretion." Richard stood in stunned silence as Victoria continued her confession, each word unraveling the carefully constructed narrative of their life together. The woman before him was both familiar and strange, his perfectly poised society wife, transformed by the weight of her long-held secret. "I visited them whenever I could," she said, pacing the room. "In those first months at St. Catherine's, I would slip away at night. Maria helped me. She was the only one who seemed to understand. I would sing to them, hold them when no one was watching. But my father said it had to stop, that people would start asking questions." "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked, his voice gentle despite the betrayal he felt. "All these years, Victoria, did you think I wouldn't understand?" She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "I was afraid. When I met you, you were everything good and decent in my world. You looked at me like I was pure, untouched by scandal. I couldn't bear to see that change." A soft knock interrupted them. Thomas stood in the doorway, his expression grave. "Mrs. Coleman, Maria asked me to tell you. Sophie's fever has gotten worse. She's asking for her mother." Victoria's composure crumbled entirely. Without a word to Richard, she rushed past Thomas, her heels clicking rapidly down the marble hallway toward the guest house. Richard followed, watching as his wife's perfectly maintained facade fell away with each step. In the guest house, they found Sophie curled up on the bed, her face flushed with fever. Emma sat beside her, holding her hand, while Maria pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. When Victoria entered the room, both girls looked up, their eyes widening with recognition. "I know you," Sophie whispered, her voice weak but certain. "You're the lady who used to sing to us, the one with the locket." Victoria approached the bed slowly, as if moving through a dream. With trembling fingers, she opened her locket again, showing the girls the photograph inside. "I kept you with me," she said softly. "Every day, every moment, you were never truly gone." Emma reached out, touching the tiny photograph. "We used to dream about you," she said. "We would make up stories about who you might be, why you left us. Some of the other girls at St. Catherine's told us we were abandoned, but we never believed. Just something inside us knew. You were never abandoned," Victoria interrupted, her voice fierce with sudden emotion. "You were protected, hidden away because the world can be cruel to children born of scandal. But not for one moment were you unloved." Richard watched from the doorway as Victoria gathered both girls in her arms, their tears mingling as 16. Years of separation dissolved in a single embrace. Maria slipped past him, dabbing at her own eyes. "Mr. Coleman," she whispered, "there's something else you should know. When the girls first arrived at St. Catherine's, they came with trust, funds, anonymous accounts set up in their names, accessible when they turned 21. I helped manage the paperwork." "Harrison Wells?" Richard guessed. Maria shook her head. "No, the money came from Victoria herself. She sold every piece of jewelry she owned, every investment her family had given her. Everything except that locket." The revelation added another layer to Victoria's sacrifice. She hadn't just given up her daughters, She had ensured their future security, even while maintaining the fiction of their abandonment. "Richard?" Victoria's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She still held the girls, but her eyes were fixed on him. "I know I've lied to you. I know this changes everything, but please, they need a home. A real home." Before he could respond, Emma spoke. "Up. We can leave if this is too complicated. Sophie and we've always managed on our own." "No," Richard said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "No one is leaving." He crossed the room to join them, seeing not the scandal that Victoria had feared would destroy them, but a family fractured by circumstance and finally finding its way back together. Sophie's fever began to break under Maria's careful attention. As the night deepened, Richard found himself sitting in the guest house living room, listening as Victoria softly sang the same lullabies she had sung 16 years ago. The girls drifted off to sleep, their hands still intertwined, while Victoria watched over them with a mix of joy and lingering sadness. "Tomorrow," she said quietly to Richard, "I'll need to make some calls. My father, the board of directors. At the foundation, everyone will need to be told the scandal will be enormous." "We'll handle it together," Richard assured her. "But Victoria, there's something I need to know. All these years, every time you hosted a charity gala for children's homes, every donation you insisted we make to adoption services, was it all because of them?" Victoria's hand went to her locket, the gesture so familiar, yet now laden with new meaning. "Every single one," she admitted. "I couldn't help my own daughters, so I tried to help others. It was the only way I could live with myself." The morning light filtered through the guest house windows, casting long shadows across the sleeping forms of Emma and Sophie. Victoria had spent the night in an armchair between their beds, refusing to leave their side. As Richard brought her a cup of coffee, he noticed how different she looked, younger somehow, as if the weight of her secret had been aging her all these years. "The board meeting is in 2 hours," she said quietly, accepting the coffee. "My father will be there. He doesn't know yet about the girls being found, about any of this." Richard sat beside her, watching the gentle rise and fall of the girls' chests as they slept. "How do you want to handle this?" Before Victoria could answer, Maria burst into the room, her usually calm demeanor shattered. "Mrs. Coleman, Mr. Coleman, you need to see this immediately." She thrust her tablet toward them, displaying the homepage of a prominent society blog. The headline made Victoria's coffee cup slip from her fingers, shattering on the floor. "Coleman Family Scandal. Mysterious teens spotted at estate. Sources reveal shocking connection to Victoria Coleman's past." The noise woke the girls, who sat up groggily as Richard quickly scanned the article. Someone had leaked photos of Emma and Sophie entering the estate, along with old records from St. Catherine's home. The article stopped short of making direct accusations, but the implications were clear. "How?" Victoria whispered, her face ashen. "Who could have—" "Thomas," Maria said grimly. "I saw him taking pictures on his phone last night. He must have sold the story." Richard's jaw tightened. "I'll handle Thomas. Victoria, you need to get to that board meeting before your father sees this. Take control of the narrative before someone else does." "I'm coming with you," Emma announced, standing up. Sophie nodded in agreement, already out of bed. Victoria shook her head. "No, it's too dangerous. The media will be everywhere." "We're not hiding anymore," Sophie said firmly, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that Victoria possessed. "We've spent our whole lives not knowing who we are. Now we know, and we're not letting you face this alone." Richard watched as something shifted in Victoria's expression, pride mixed with a touch of fear and overwhelming love. "Maria," she said, not taking her eyes off the girls, "please bring 2 of my dresses from the house, and my mother's, pearls from the safe, the ones I was saving for a special occasion." As Maria hurried to comply, Victoria turned to her daughters. "If we are going to face the world, we'll do it on our terms. No more shadows, no more shame." The next hour was a flurry of activity. Under Victoria's guidance, the girls were transformed. From street waifs into poised young women who could have stepped out of any society page. Emma wore a pale blue Chanel suit that could have been tailored for her, while Sophie was elegant in cream-colored Carolina Herrera. The family resemblance, already striking, was now undeniable. "There's one more thing," Victoria said, reaching behind her neck to unclasp her golden locket. With trembling fingers, she fastened it around Sophie's neck. "This belongs to both of you now. Inside isn't just your baby picture, there's a key. It opens a safety deposit box at First Manhattan Bank. Everything I saved for you is there. Letters I wrote every birthday, photos I managed to get from St. Catherine's, and documents proving your identity. You never stopped thinking about us," Emma said softly, touching the locket now hanging around her sister's neck. "Not for a single day," Victoria replied, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from Emma's suit. "Now, let's go face the board, and my father." The drive to the Coleman Foundation headquarters was tense. Richard insisted on having his personal security team escort them, knowing the media would be waiting. He wasn't wrong. Photographers swarmed the car as they pulled up to the building's private entrance. Victoria stepped out first, her head held high. The cameras exploded with flashes as Emma and Sophie emerged behind her, looking every inch the society debutantes they should have been. The resemblance between the three women was impossible to miss, and the reporters' questions grew more frenzied. "Mrs. Coleman, are these your secret daughters? Victoria, is it true they were hidden at St. Catherine's? What does your father have to say about this?" Victoria paused at the building's entrance, turning to face the media circus. Richard held his breath, knowing his wife well enough to recognize the look in her eyes. She was about to change everything. "These young women," Victoria said, her voice clear and unwavering, "are Emma and Sophie Coleman. They are my daughters and they have come home. Any other questions can be addressed through our legal team." With that, she ushered the girls inside, leaving the reporters in stunned silence. Richard followed, catching a glimpse of Thomas hovering near the service entrance. Their eyes met, and Thomas quickly disappeared back inside. The elevator ride to the boardroom floor was silent. Victoria stood between her daughters, holding their hands, while Richard watched the floor numbers climb. When the doors opened, they found Victoria's father, William Montgomery, waiting in the hallway. The elderly man's face went through a range of emotions as he took in the scene before him. Shock, recognition, fear, and finally, a kind of resigned acceptance. "I always knew this day might come," he said quietly, "though I prayed it wouldn't." "It's not up to you anymore, Father," Victoria replied, her grip tightening on her daughter's hands. "The truth is out, and I'm done hiding." William's eyes swept over Emma and Sophie, lingering on the familiar features he'd tried so hard to conceal from the world. "The board is waiting," he said finally. "I suppose we all have some explaining to do." As they walked toward the boardroom, Richard noticed something remarkable. Victoria, who had spent decades seeking her father's approval, didn't even glance his way. Her focus was entirely on her daughters, on protecting them from the storm they were about to face. The boardroom of the Coleman Foundation fell silent as Victoria entered with Emma and Sophie. The long mahogany table was surrounded by the city's most powerful figures, board members who had known Victoria since childhood, who had attended her wedding to Richard, who had believed the carefully constructed lie about her time in Switzerland. "Ladies and gentlemen," William Montgomery began, but Victoria cut him off. "I'll speak for myself, Father," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in society's spotlight. "I've spent 16 years letting others tell my story. That ends today." The board members exchanged glances as Victoria guided her daughters to seats at the table. Richard took his place beside them, while William Montgomery sank into his chair at the head of the table, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. "You all know me as Victoria Coleman, chair of the Foundation's charitable initiatives," she began. "What you don't know is that before I married Richard, before I became the person you think you know, I was a very different Victoria Montgomery." She reached for the tablet in front of her, pulling up the society blog that had broken the story. "I'm sure you've all seen this by now. The media is speculating, creating their own version of events. Here's the truth. 16 years ago, I gave birth to twin daughters. Their father was Harrison Wells." The name sent a ripple through the room. Harrison Wells had been one of their own, A board member, a trusted associate, a married man with political aspirations. His mysterious withdrawal from public life had been the subject of gossip for years. My father, Victoria continued, glancing at William, believed he was protecting me by hiding my pregnancy, by sending me to Lancaster, by arranging for my daughters to be taken to St. Catherine's. He thought he was preserving our family's reputation, the foundation's integrity, Harrison's marriage. She paused, looking at Emma and Sophie. What he didn't understand was that he was breaking 3 hearts instead of just one. One of the board members, an elderly woman who had been Victoria's mother's closest friend, spoke up. "My dear, why come forward now? Why not let sleeping dogs lie?" Emma answered before Victoria could, her voice strong and clear. "Because lies don't sleep, they grow. Sophie and I spent 16 years wondering who we were, where we came from. We deserve the truth, and so does everyone else." "The foundation has always championed family values," Sophie added, showing the same natural grace under pressure as her mother. "Shouldn't that start with honesty in our own families?" Richard watched as the board members' expressions shifted from shock to something closer to understanding. These weren't the scandal-tainted children they'd feared. These were poised, intelligent young women who carried themselves with dignity despite their circumstances. Victoria stood, commanding the room's attention once more. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or understanding. I'm here to announce changes to the Foundation's mission. Effective immediately, I want to establish a new initiative focused on supporting young mothers in crisis, ensuring they don't have to make the impossible choices I faced. The press will have a field day," one of the younger board members warned. "Our donors will appreciate our honesty and commitment to real change," Richard interrupted, speaking for the first time. "I've already pledged $50 million to launch the initiative." William Montgomery stirred in his chair. "Victoria, be reasonable. Think about what this could do to everything we've built." "I am being reasonable, Father," Victoria replied. "For the first time in 16 years, I'm thinking clearly. Emma and Sophie aren't a scandal to be hidden. They're my daughters, and they're coming home to the life they should have had all along." Just then, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Mrs. Coleman, there's something you need to see." He handed her his phone, displaying a breaking news alert. Harrison Wells had just called an emergency press conference at his Hamptons estate. The headline read, "Business mogul to address Coleman family allegations." Victoria's hand tightened. On the phone. After 16 years of silence, now he wants to speak. "We should get ahead of this," Richard suggested, but Victoria shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Let him talk. I'm done running, done hiding. Whatever he says can't change the truth, and the truth is sitting right here." She gestured to Emma and Sophie, who sat tall and proud despite the tension in the room. "Mrs. Coleman," Maria's voice came urgently through the intercom. "The press is gathering outside. They're saying Mr. Wells has evidence, documents from Lancaster, photographs. He's claiming he has a different version of events." The boardroom erupted in whispered conversations. William Montgomery slumped further in his chair, while some board members began gathering their things, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the impending storm. But Victoria remained standing, a strange smile playing at her lips. "Perfect," she said, surprising everyone. "Let him show his evidence, let him tell his version, because I have something he doesn't." She looked at her daughters, tears shining in her eyes, but her voice steady. "I have the truth, and I have my girls." The atmosphere in the Coleman Foundation's private conference room was electric as Harrison Wells' press conference began streaming on the wall-mounted screen. The once powerful businessman looked older. Than his 60 years, his formerly commanding presence diminished by time and secrets. Emma and Sophie sat between Victoria and Richard, their eyes fixed on the face of the man who had never acknowledged their existence. "I've called this press conference to address the rumors circulating about my connection to the Coleman family," Wells began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a seasoned public speaker. 16 years ago, I made decisions that I've regretted every day since." Victoria's hand found Sophie's, squeezing gently as Wells continued. My relationship with Victoria Montgomery was more than a scandal. It was a betrayal of trust on many levels, but the story being told is incomplete. He paused, shuffling, papers on the podium before him. I never abandoned my daughters. I was forced away. The boardroom erupted in murmurs. William Montgomery stood abruptly, his face flushed. He's lying. I'll not sit here and listen to... Let him speak, Victoria commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. On screen, Wells was producing documents. These are records from Lancaster Psychiatric Center, he continued. They show that I attempted to visit multiple times, that I tried to establish a trust fund for the girls. William Montgomery blocked every attempt, threatening to expose other aspects of my business dealings if I didn't stay away. Emma leaned forward, studying the man, who had contributed to half her genetic makeup. He looks scared, she observed quietly. He should be, William spat, if he thinks he can rewrite history. Father? Victoria interrupted. Sit down. The authority in her voice was absolute, and for perhaps the first time in his life, William Montgomery obeyed his daughter without question. On screen, Wells was building to his crescendo. Speaking out now because I recently learned that my daughters have been living on the streets, while their mother enjoys a life of privilege. I'm hereby announcing my intention to seek custody. The screen went black. Richard stood by the control panel, remote in hand. I think we've heard enough, he said quietly. Victoria rose slowly, her composure absolute despite the trembling in her hands. Maria, she called out, knowing her faithful housekeeper would be monitoring the situation. Please bring me the red file from my private safe. Victoria, William warned, think carefully about what you're doing. I have thought about it, Father. For 16 years I've thought about nothing else. She turned to the board members who sat in stunned silence. What Harrison failed to mention in his press conference was the series of threatening letters he sent me while I was at Lancaster. Letters demanding that I terminate the pregnancy to protect his reputation. Letters that I kept, along with the original trust fund documents, showing that he explicitly signed away all parental rights. Maria entered with a red leather folder, handling it like it contained explosives. Victoria took it, removing a stack of yellowed papers. I was young, scared, and in love with a man who proved to be a coward, she continued. But I was never stupid. Every letter, every document, every piece of evidence, I kept it all. Not for revenge, but for my daughters, so that one day they would know the whole truth. Emma and Sophie stood together, their presence commanding. Attention just as their mothers did. We don't need custody hearings, Emma announced. We're 16 now, old enough to choose for ourselves. Sophie nodded in agreement. And we choose our mother, the woman who never stopped loving us, who kept us in her heart even when she couldn't keep us in her home. One of the board members, a distinguished judge, cleared his throat. Given the girl's age and the circumstances, no court would seriously entertain Wells' custody claim. This is clearly a desperate attempt at damage control. Perhaps, Richard said thoughtfully, but it's given us an opportunity. Victoria, my dear, I believe it's time for Plan B. Victoria's eyes met her husband's, understanding passing between them. You're right, she turned to the board. Ladies and gentlemen, in light of these developments, I'd like to propose an emergency session. The Foundation's mission has always been to help families in crisis. It's time we expanded that mission to include a very specific type of crisis. She pressed a button on the conference room phone. Thomas, please contact every major news outlet. In 1 hour, the Coleman Foundation will be making an announcement that will change the way society views and supports young mothers in difficult situations. William Montgomery slumped in his chair, recognition dawning on his face. You're going to turn this into a cause. No, Father, Victoria corrected him. I'm going to turn this into a revolution. Everything you and Harrison tried to hide, every shame you tried to bury, we're going to bring it into the light. Not as scandal, but as strength. She looked at her daughters, seeing in them the same determination that had helped her survive 16 years of secrets. Emma, Sophie, are you ready to help other girls who might be facing what I faced? The twins exchanged glances before Sophie spoke for both of them. We've spent our whole lives feeling lost. If we can help prevent that feeling in others, that's better than any revenge. Richard watched proudly as his wife and her daughters stood together, 3 generations of strength finally united. The board members reading the room began nodding in agreement. Even William Montgomery, despite his earlier protests, seemed to deflate in acceptance. "Maria," Victoria called out, "please bring me my laptop. We have a press release to write, and this time we're telling the whole story. Not just what happened 16 years ago, but what happens next. Because this isn't just about our family anymore. It's about every family that's ever been torn apart by shame and secrets." As Maria hurried to comply, Emma turned to her mother. "What do you mean, what happens next?" Victoria smiled, the kind of smile that had launched 1,000 charity galas and changed countless lives. "My darling girls, we're going to build something new, something that will help other young mothers keep their children, help other families stay together. The shame that tore us apart. We're going to turn it into a bridge that brings people together." The next hour transformed the Coleman Foundation's headquarters into a hive of activity. Victoria, with Emma and Sophie by her side, worked tirelessly on crafting their message. Richard coordinated with the PR team, while Maria ensured that every detail was perfect for the press conference. That would change everything. "The statement needs to be personal," Emma suggested, reading over her mother's draft. "People respond to real stories, not just statistics." Sophie nodded in agreement. "Tell them about the lullabies, Mom, about how you never stopped thinking about us, even when you couldn't be with us." Victoria paused in her typing, struck by her daughter's intuitive understanding of human nature. Despite their years in hardship, or perhaps because of them, they had developed a profound empathy for others' struggles. "You're right," she said, beginning to revise the text. "This isn't just about policy changes or funding. It's about healing, about giving people hope that families can overcome anything if they're given the right support." Richard entered the conference room with Thomas, who looked decidedly uncomfortable. "The press is assembled downstairs," Richard announced, "and Thomas has something he'd like to say." The young assistant stepped forward, unable to meet Victoria's eyes. "Mrs. Coleman, I want to apologize. Wells' people approached me weeks ago offering money for information. I thought I was doing the right thing, exposing what I believed was wrongdoing." Victoria studied him for a moment. "You acted on what you knew, Thomas, but next time come to me first. You might be surprised by the truth." "There's more," Thomas added hesitantly. "Wells's team, they've been asking questions at St. Catherine's, trying to build a case about negligence, about how the girls ended up on the streets. They're trying to shift blame." "Let them try," Sophie said firmly. "We know our story. We chose to leave St. Catherine's because we were searching for something. We just didn't know it was our mother we were looking for." Victoria's hand went to where her locket usually rested, then smiled, remembering it now hung around Sophie's neck. "Thomas, I want you to handle our social media response. You understand how to reach people. Use that skill for something positive this time." The young man nodded eagerly, relieved to be given a chance at redemption. As he left to begin his task, William Montgomery entered the room, looking more subdued than anyone had ever seen him. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I've been making some calls. Harrison's press conference. It's backfired. His own board is questioning his judgment, and several of his biggest investors are distancing themselves." "I don't care about Harrison's business troubles," Victoria replied, not looking up from her laptop. "This isn't about destroying him, it's about building something new." "That's what I'm trying to tell you," William continued. "His investors, they're interested in your initiative. They want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. The funding could be substantial." Now Victoria did look up, meeting her father's eyes. "Are you trying to help, Father?" William moved closer, looking at his granddaughters with a mixture of regret and pride. 16 years ago, I thought I was protecting our family's reputation. I was wrong. These girls, they're not a scandal to be hidden. They're my granddaughters, and it's time I started acting like their grandfather." Emma and Sophie exchanged glances, years of practiced silent communication passing between them. Then Sophie stood, removing Victoria's locket from around her neck. She approached William slowly. "We found this picture inside," she said, opening the locket to reveal the tiny photograph of two newborn girls. "Mom kept us close to her heart all these years. Maybe there's room in your heart too." The elderly man's hands trembled as he took the locket, staring at the photograph he'd never allowed himself to see before. "There always was," he whispered. "I just didn't know how to show it." Victoria watched the scene unfold, tears threatening to spill onto her carefully applied makeup. Richard squeezed her hand supportively as Maria entered to announce that the press was ready. "Mrs. Coleman," Maria said softly, "you should see this." She held up her tablet, showing social media exploding with support. Women were sharing their own stories of difficult choices, of family separations, of reconciliations. The hashtag #MargColemanTruth was trending nationwide. "It's time," Richard said gently. "Are you ready?" Victoria stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced grace. Emma and Sophie moved to flank her, their poses unconsciously mirroring their mothers. William Montgomery stepped forward to join them, standing tall for the first time since the truth had emerged. "Ready?" Victoria asked her daughters, seeing in their faces the same strength she'd had to find within herself 16 years ago. "Ready," they replied in unison. As they moved toward the elevator that would take them to the press conference, Victoria felt a profound shift in the universe. The shame that had haunted her for so long was transforming into something powerful, something that could help others find their way home, just as her daughters had found their way back to her. The press conference room at the Coleman Foundation hummed with anticipation. Cameras flashed as Victoria stepped up to the podium, Emma and Sophie standing proudly beside her. The girls had insisted on being present, their natural poise drawing admiring murmurs from the assembled journalists. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice steady and clear, 16 years ago, I made a choice that shaped not just my life, but the lives of my two beautiful daughters. Society told me to hide them away, to be ashamed, to pretend they never existed. Today, we're here to say that era of shame ends now." She gestured to a large screen behind her, where images began to appear. Statistics on young mothers in crisis, data on family separations, stories of reunions years in the making. But among these, personal touches appeared. The golden locket, now a symbol of enduring love, and a photograph of Victoria singing to her infant daughters at St. Catherine's, secretly captured by Maria all those years ago. The Coleman Foundation is announcing the creation of the New Dawn Initiative, Victoria continued. A comprehensive program that will provide support, resources, and most importantly, hope to young mothers facing impossible choices. No woman should ever have to choose between her children and her future. Emma stepped forward to the microphone, her voice strong despite her youth. "My sister and I spent years searching for our identity, not knowing that our mother was searching for us too. Every young woman deserves the chance to write her own story, without shame or judgment." Sophie joined her sister, adding, "We're not just launching a program, we're starting a movement that says family bonds are stronger than social prejudices." The reporter's hands shot up, questions flying from all directions. But before Victoria could respond, the doors at the back of the room burst open. Harrison Wells strode in, flanked by his lawyers. "A touching performance," he announced, his voice carrying over the sudden murmurs. "But let's talk about the real story, about how these girls were abandoned not once, but twice. First by their mother, and then by the very institution that promised to protect them." Richard moved to intervene, but Victoria held up her hand, stopping him. "Actually, Harrison, let's talk about the real story." She nodded to Thomas, who began typing frantically on his laptop. The screen behind them changed, displaying a series of dated photographs. "These were taken at Lancaster Psychiatric Center," Victoria explained, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "They show a young woman, barely 20, reading letters from a man who promised to stand by her, who swore his love was worth any sacrifice." The images advanced, showing a much younger Victoria, her hand resting on her swollen belly as she read what were clearly Harrison's letters. But then the letters changed, didn't they, Harrison? She produced a stack of papers from her portfolio. When your political ambitions grew, when your business partners started asking questions, suddenly your tune changed. Shall I read them to everyone? Shall I share how you demanded I take care of the problem to protect your reputation? Harrison's face had gone pale. Those letters are private correspondence. Nothing is private anymore, Emma interrupted, her voice carrying the same authority as her mother's. Not your threats, not your abandonment, not your attempts to rewrite history. Sophie stepped forward, removing the locket from around her neck. You want to talk about abandonment? Our mother kept us close to her heart every single day. Where were you? The room had gone completely silent, every camera focused on the unfolding drama. Harrison's lawyers were whispering urgently in his ear, but he seemed frozen in place. William Montgomery chose that moment to step forward, placing himself between Harrison and his family. I made many mistakes, he announced to the room. I thought I was protecting my daughter by hiding her pregnancy, by separating her from her children. I was wrong, but you, Harrison, you were a coward then, and you're a coward now. Victoria touched her father's arm gently, moving him aside. This press conference isn't about assigning blame, she said, addressing the room but looking directly at Harrison. It's about creating change. The New Dawn initiative will ensure that no other young woman faces these choices alone. And Mr. Wells, you're welcome to contribute, from a distance. The implied threat in her voice was clear. Harrison's lawyers finally succeeded in pulling him toward the exit, but the damage was done. The reporter's attention had shifted entirely to Victoria and her daughters there. Questions now focused on the future rather than the past. Mrs. Coleman, a young reporter called out, how will the New Dawn initiative actually help young mothers? Victoria smiled, genuine warmth replacing the steel in her voice. I'm glad you asked. Emma, Sophie, would you like to explain your ideas for the peer support program? The girls stepped forward confidently, beginning to outline their vision for a network of support groups led by women who had faced similar challenges. As they spoke, Victoria felt Richard's hand slip into hers. You know, he whispered, I've never been prouder to be a Coleman. Victoria squeezed his hand, watching her daughters command the room with their natural grace and passionate conviction. The shame that had haunted her for so long was transforming before her eyes into something powerful and beautiful, a force for change that would ripple out far beyond their family. In the days following the press conference, the Coleman mansion transformed from a symbol of privileged seclusion into the beating heart of the New Dawn initiative. The guest house where Emma and Sophie had first found refuge became the prototype for what would soon be a network of safe houses across the city. Victoria sat in her study, surrounded by letters and emails from women across the country, sharing their own stories of separation and hope. Emma lounged on the window seat, sorting through applications from potential peer counselors, while Sophie worked with Maria to organize the first support group meeting. Listen to this one, Emma said, holding up a letter. She's a judge now, but 30 years ago she had to give up her son. She's offering to help us navigate the legal aspects of family reunification. Victoria looked up from her own stack of correspondence. Add her to the priority list. We need people who understand both sides of the system. Mom, Sophie called from the doorway. The caterers need the final numbers for Saturday's fundraiser. Also, grandfather is here. William Montgomery entered the study, looking more relaxed than anyone could remember seeing him. The past week had aged him, but also somehow freed him. He carried a large leather portfolio. I've been going through the family archives, he said, placing the portfolio on Victoria's desk. There's something you girls should see. Emma joined them as William opened the portfolio, revealing a photograph of a young woman who could have been Victoria's twin, or Emma and Sophie's slightly older sister. This is your grandmother, William explained softly. What I never told anyone, what I buried so deep I almost convinced myself it wasn't true. She was in a similar situation to you, Victoria, but in her time, there were no options, no support. She was sent away, forced to give up her baby, me. Victoria stared at her father in shock. What are you saying? I'm saying that history repeats itself when we don't learn from it, William replied. I didn't understand why I reacted so strongly to your pregnancy, Victoria, but now I see I was unconsciously recreating the trauma that shaped my own beginnings. Sophie touched the photograph gently. That's why you're helping us now? Because you understand? William nodded, tears in his eyes. The New Dawn initiative isn't just about the future. It's about healing the past too. Richard appeared in the doorway, excitement evident in his usually composed demeanor. The first corporate pledges are coming in. Victoria, my dear, you might want to see these numbers. He handed her a tablet displaying a spreadsheet of donations. Victoria's eyes widened as she scrolled through the list. Major companies, charitable foundations, and private donors were committing substantial resources to the initiative. Look at this one, Richard said, pointing to a particularly large pledge. The donor's name made Victoria pause. It was Harrison Wells Company, but the authorization came from the board of directors. They're distancing themselves from him, Emma observed, using this as their redemption story. Let them, Sophie said pragmatically. The money will help other girls like us. Maria entered with a fresh pot of tea, her face glowing with pride as she watched the family working together. Mrs. Coleman, the media is calling again. They want to know if you'll consider writing a book about your experience. Victoria looked around the room, at her daughters, so strong and capable, at her father, finally confronting his own past, at Richard, who had stood by her through everything, and at Maria, who had kept her secret for so long. A book, she mused. Perhaps, but not just my story. All our stories. Every woman who's ever had to choose between her heart and her future. Every family torn apart by shame and secrecy. Every reunion that gives others hope. We could help write it, Emma suggested. Tell it from all perspectives. Including yours, Sophie added, looking at their grandfather. Your mother's story deserves to be told too. William straightened in his chair. Perhaps it's time for all the old secrets to come into the light. Not as sources of shame, but as bridges to understanding. Victoria rose from her desk, moving to stand between her daughters. The golden locket, now returned to its place around her neck, caught the afternoon light. When I was at Lancaster, I used to dream about a day when I could hold you both again. But this, watching you grow into such remarkable young women, seeing you turn our pain into purpose, this is better than any dream. Speaking of dreams, Richard interjected. The architect's plans for the first New Dawn Center are ready. Would you like to see them? As the family gathered around Richard's tablet, examining the plans for what would become a sanctuary for young mothers in crisis, Victoria felt a profound sense of peace. The secret that had weighed her down for 16 years had transformed into a foundation for change. Emma and Sophie, once lost but never forgotten, were now finding their own way to make a difference in the world. The shame that had torn them apart had become the force that would help keep other families together. Outside, the setting sun painted the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and rose, a new dawn already promising to break. 3 months after, the press conference that changed everything, the first New Dawn Center stood ready for its grand opening. The 6-story building in downtown Manhattan gleamed in the morning sun, its modern architecture softened by touches that made it feel more like a home than an institution. Gardens graced the rooftop and courtyard, while the windows were large and welcoming, letting in abundant natural light. Victoria stood in the entrance hall, supervising the final preparations for the opening ceremony. Emma and Sophie moved through the space with practiced ease, directing volunteers and checking details against their meticulously prepared lists. The girls had thrown themselves into the project with remarkable dedication, their own experiences informing every aspect of the center's design and programs. The first residents arrive tomorrow, Emma announced, consulting her tablet. We've already got a waiting list, but we wanted to start small, make sure we get everything right. 5 young mothers and their children, Sophie added, each with their own suite, access to education programs, childcare, counseling, everything we wished we'd had. Victoria felt her heart swell with pride. Her daughters had transformed their pain into purpose, their lost years into a blueprint for helping others. The center would provide everything from prenatal care to job training, ensuring that no young mother would have to choose between her children and her future. Mrs. Coleman, Maria approached, carrying a large package. This just arrived from Lancaster Psychiatric Center. Victoria opened the package carefully, revealing a stack of old records and photographs. The current administration at Lancaster had been surprisingly cooperative once they understood the center's mission, offering historical documents to help track similar cases and reunite families. "Look at this," Victoria said softly, holding up a faded photograph. It showed the psychiatric center's nursery from 16 years ago, and there in the background was a much younger Maria, watching over 2 tiny bassinets. "I remember that day," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was the last time you got to hold them before." She trailed off, the memory still painful after all these years. "Before everyone decided what was best for us," Emma finished, but there was no bitterness in her voice. "And now we get to decide what's best for others." The sound of cameras and voices from outside announced the arrival of the press. Richard entered through the side door, impeccable in his suit despite the early hour. "The media's here, and you'll never guess who else showed up." Victoria didn't have to guess. Through the glass doors, she could see Harrison Wells standing, awkwardly on the sidewalk, alone this time, without his lawyers or entourage. He looked older, diminished somehow, holding what appeared to be an envelope. "Should we have security remove him?" Richard asked, but Victoria shook her head. "Let him come in," she said, surprising everyone. "It's time to end this chapter properly." Emma and Sophie exchanged glances, then nodded their agreement. As Harrison entered the building, the contrast between his uncertainty and the girl's confidence was striking. These poised young women bore little resemblance to the scared teenagers who had huddled under a bridge just months ago. "Victoria," Harrison began, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Girls, I've been doing a lot of thinking." "That must be a novel experience," Sophie remarked dryly, earning a quick smile from her sister. Harrison flushed, but continued. "I've resigned from the company. The board, they suggested it would be best. But before I leave York, I wanted to give you this." He held out the envelope. "It's everything I have, the company shares, the Hampton estate, the offshore accounts. I'm signing it all over to the New Dawn Initiative." Victoria studied the man she had once loved, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "Why now, Harrison?" "Because you were right," he said simply. "About everything. I was a coward then, and I've been a coward every day since. But watching you all these past months, seeing what you've built, how you've turned scandal into strength, I want to do one right thing before I go." Emma stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "You know this doesn't change the past, right? You can't buy your way into our lives." "I know," Harrison nodded. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or a relationship. I just want to help make sure no other father makes the mistakes I did." Victoria accepted the envelope, not opening it yet. "The money will help a lot of families," she said carefully, "but you're right, it doesn't change what happened." "I know," Harrison repeated, already turning to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at his daughters one last time. "You both look so much like your mother when I first met her, but you're stronger than either of us ever was." After he left, a heavy silence fell over the entrance hall. Sophie was the first to break it, her voice practical and forward-looking, just like her mother's. "Well, that should help fund the expansion to Chicago ahead of schedule." The tension broke as everyone laughed. Victoria pulled her daughters close, marveling at their resilience. Richard joined them, wrapping his arms around all 3 women. "The press is waiting," he reminded them gently, "ready to show the world what real family values look like." Victoria touched the locket at her throat, then looked at the building. Around them, a dream made real through love, determination, and the strength to face the truth. "More than ready," she said. "It's time for a new dawn." 1 year later, the rooftop garden of the New Dawn Center was in full bloom, mirroring the flourishing of lives within its walls. Victoria stood among the roses and herbs, watching as Emma led a support group session, while Sophie conducted a tour for potential donors. The centre had already helped dozens of young mothers rebuild their lives, creating ripples of change throughout society. The golden locket still hung around Victoria's neck, but it no longer carried the weight of secrets. Inside, alongside the old photograph of her infant daughters, she had added a new picture, one taken at the centre's opening ceremony, showing 3 generations of the Coleman family standing united and proud. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Richard's voice interrupted her reverie. He joined her at the garden's railing, where the Manhattan skyline stretched out before them like a sea of possibilities. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," Victoria replied, watching as Emma expertly guided her group through a discussion about breaking the cycle of family trauma. "A year ago, I was still carrying the heaviest secret of my life. Now look at them. They're changing the world." Indeed, Emma and Sophie had blossomed beyond anyone's expectations. Emma had discovered a talent for counseling, her own experiences, giving her a unique ability to connect with young mothers in crisis. Sophie, meanwhile, had revealed a gift for organization and advocacy, becoming the center's most effective spokesperson. "Mrs. Coleman," Maria appeared in the rooftop doorway. "The film crew is here for the documentary interview." The documentary had been Emma's idea, a way to share their story and the center's mission with a wider audience. But more than that, it was a chance to show other families that healing was possible, that shame could be transformed into strength. As Victoria made her way downstairs, she passed walls lined with photographs, not just of her own family, but of all the mothers and children who had found refuge at the center. Each picture told a story of reunion, recovery, and renewal. In the main conference room, William Montgomery was already chatting with the documentary crew. The past year had softened him remarkably. He had become a devoted grandfather, and his business expertise had proven invaluable in expanding the New Dawn initiative across the country. "There you are," he greeted Victoria warmly. "I was just telling them about our latest project, the scholarship program for young mothers returning to school." "Grandfather's been an amazing advocate," Sophie said, joining them after finishing her tour. "Who knew all those years of